Well, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Very pleased to be addressing the audience today. As noted, my name is Kevin Kiley. I'm with a company called OneTrust. We have a suite of products around privacy management for large enterprise. So obviously, at this time, with GDPR coming very close, it's a busy time, I think, for many of us in the room. But especially for us as our tools are uniquely aligned, I think, to the needs of an organization trying to comply with the GDPR. Do I have a clicker? Is there one here somewhere? Did the last speaker take it, maybe? Nope. Very much. Okay. So again, a bit about our company. We offer a suite of tools that help you do a lot of the responsibilities you have under the GDPR, collecting information, building out your records of processing, key responsibilities that your organization has under Article 30 for accountability and being able to demonstrate to the regulators that you've taken steps to really embrace the spirit and the letter of the law under the GDPR. Will help you with automating a lot of that and allow you to focus more on the human aspects. We'll take care of a lot of the administrative capabilities by sending out those questionnaires, making sure that information is being collected, and that, again, you've got strong reporting to show should the regulators come calling for it. That's about the end of the sales pitch. I don't want to talk too much about the product, but instead really try to keep this discussion today focused on how you can comply and useful information for you. I'll begin by saying privacy is really a human issue, and I think this is somewhat understood. Very often we talk at conferences like this where there's a real security focus, and people tend to maybe over-rotate a little bit on that. Security, of course, is a key concern here. We need to protect the information, but security is going to be more focused with the needs of the organization. Privacy is about the individual, that human level, again, making sure that we're not over-collecting information, asking for things that we shouldn't be collecting as part of a business process. So respecting both of them, both at the individual level and the technical and security level. Obviously, for most of your organizations, the GDPR is going to require major changes. You're going to have to go back and review different business processes, again, what data you're collecting on individuals, how it's being processed, where it's being processed, what is the purpose of that. You'll have to have a legal basis for any information that you're processing, and there's 6 under the law that you'll have to be familiar with and try to understand. Now, if anyone's familiar with the American author Mark Twain, I've always been fond of the quote, if I had had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. That's sort of appropriate here with so much to talk about as we get into GDPR and what it means for your organization. It's very difficult to try to compress this into a small talk. But I'll just say that, again, this is going to make major change for your organization, and it's something that you will have to do whether you collect data from a consumer or your employees, etc., or if you're doing this on behalf of other organizations. Whether you're a processor or a controller under the law, be aware that you've got major changes and compliance obligations that are coming next month. On the screen behind me is a list of some of the key articles, and I'll focus on a few of these here that I think, again, are going to be more operationally difficult for organizations. And I'll also mention, I see a number of you taking pictures. You're very welcome to take pictures of all the slides. I'm also happy to give you my slide deck afterwards if you want to. I can email it to you and you can get all the information from there. But let me talk through just this list here quickly and make sure we've at least touched on each point. I mentioned the first one, the legal basis for processing, that there are 6 different legal bases that you'll want to look at. And these are things like legitimate interest. I have to do this for the work that I'm conducting on behalf of this individual. I have to know a little bit about them or what their needs are. You may also have legal or national interest obligations, having to collect data for the sake of making sure that someone is a citizen or that they've got tax responsibility. You may have to process some of this information just on the basis of anti-money laundering or terrorism laws, etc. The one that's probably the most common going into the GDPR, a lot of organizations that had been processing data on behalf of consumers, was consent. And consent is one that's going to change a lot. It really moves from being sort of a concept to a very specific legal instrument, and the threshold for using consent I think is going to be a lot more difficult. So I won't be able to get into all of these again just now in this short talk, but we're happy to discuss them afterwards. Legal basis, of course, a key one. Policy notice and transparency. You'll now be required to have a very clear policy that must be well understood by the individual. You've got to be transparent about changes as things evolve in your organization, that you keep that updated. That's a key part of Article 13. The third here is data protection by design and default. This is a Canadian concept that is embraced throughout the GDPR, and it really just means, again, are you looking at privacy as a core concept as you build out any new function of your business, any marketing processing activity? Have we really, made sure that we're not over collecting information, again, that we're taking the appropriate protections for the individual, and that that's core to anything that you're doing? The fourth one here is data protection impact assessments, DPIAs as they're referred to. These are an additional level of scrutiny you'll be required to look at as you collect information that is considered to be of a higher sensitivity. This can be things like religion, race, sexual orientation, trade union membership. These sensitive categories that the law says you'll now have to take an extra level of precaution to protect against. And as part of that, the law requires you to do a full assessment known as a DPIA of those processes and their necessity. Fifth is our joint liability with vendors and sub-processors. As I mentioned, whether you're processing the information on behalf of someone else or within your own organization, know that you've got responsibilities. Article 28 really goes into those. As you work with other companies, you're going to probably need to go back and look at your contracts and just make sure that, again, you've understood who has obligations for what in the event that something goes wrong, if there's a breach, if there's some other sort of security incident. You both may have responsibilities for communicating to either the individuals that are impacted or even the regulators and allowing them to know about it and taking steps to act on it. The sixth point here, data protection officer tasks, Article 39 under the law. There is, by any number of estimates, somewhere between 75 and 85,000 Dpos that are needed this year. And right now the market has about 15,000 available. So if anyone's looking for a new career, this is a great role. There's a lot of opportunity. Companies are hiring very quickly and trying to scramble and get someone into these positions, and there's just not enough of them out in the market. The next is Article 7 and consent obligations. I touched on this briefly about legal basis for processing. Below that, we see the cookie online tracking and marketing reform. This is something that is present both in the GDPR, but also in the coming regulation known as the e-privacy regulation. This was something that they were intending to release at the same time as GDPR. It's still in draft format in front of the Parliament, but it looks like it is moving forward. It will have major impacts in the way that you're processing data from visitors that arrive on your websites, cookies that you place on them, and other marketing aspects of how you do e-marketing. Continuing down the list here, we heard earlier about the 72-hour data breach reporting. That's under Articles 33 and 34. Again, very, very important responsibilities. Below that, I mentioned already our records of processing activities for Article 30. The next would be data portability and erasure, a right to be forgotten, something that's discussed often. Again, your consumers, your individuals, your employees all have a whole new set of rights that they can exercise to ask you what information do you have on them. They can demand that you correct it if there's considered to be things that are errant, and they may even ask that you forget about it. This, again, will be one of those key operational challenges. If you think about how many consumers or individuals you are processing data on, the fact that any one of them can come to you and say, turn over your records on me, and by the way, you have to do that within 30 days. You'll have to not only collect all this information from across your organization, from accounting, customer service, and any other department that might have data, but you'll have to be able to publish that back to the user. Now, you can delay this once for 30 days, but if you do that, you still have to evidence your reason for it. You have to have a strong reason and rationale for the postponement. Finishing out the list here, we've got international data transfers, something that was already somewhat prescribed in the law. You see the harmonization now across the GDPR and the additional requirements you'll have to do to protect and make sure that any data that's flowing outside of the EU meets your obligations for protections. The last two here, codes of conduct and certifications under Article 40 and 42. And then finally, security, balancing the risk, state of art and cost. That's Article 32. Again, a lot of people often confuse the GDPR as being mostly about security. It really is one article that specifically goes into security. And Article 32 just says that you've got to look at the risk of harm to the individual and balance that with appropriate security measures. Now, there's a lot of room for interpretation there, and we'll see how this comes out as the law goes into enforcement, but effectively saying, look at the costs and the danger to the individual and try to come up with the best approach. So some ambiguity there, but one that is probably going to invite a lot of subjective interpretation from regulators if something goes wrong. Okay, so that's a mouthful. It's a long list of obligations that you now have under the law. Each of these, again, puts a lot of new requirements for how you work and the record keeping that you take inside your organization. Elements of this, again, are going to be comprised with your security platform, but the main message here I want to emphasize is, again, that you're keeping good records of all of these things. Not only do you have to do all of them to get compliant with the law, but you're going to have to document it and have good record keeping that you can immediately turn over should a regulator come calling. What's important there, of course, is I don't want to dump all of my information on the regulator because they're asking for specific things, perhaps. You want to be able to go back and very narrowly answer the question that you've been asked. You don't want to invite more investigation or perhaps something that would create additional concerns. So we talked about privacy and security, and again, of the 99 articles, just that one that really deals with security. There are other references to security throughout the GDPR, but Article 32 is the one to focus on as you look at your responsibilities. We see a lot of vendors talking about the fines, and yes, there will be consequences for organizations that are really out of compliance with the law. But I would tell you the 2% and 4% fines you're hearing about are only a small aspect of it. Again, these things will be assessed in cases where the regulators feel you really are not embracing the law or taking steps to get there. I would tell you, and I work with a lot of clients that are specifically very focused on GDPR right now, almost no one is going to be ready come May 25th. I think it'll be very few organizations that can say that they're truly compliant. Instead, look at ways to show that you're making a good faith effort to get there, that you're taking steps to prepare, that you're changing the way that your organization is working, and that you're doing this record keeping. The 2% and 4% fines, when those are assessed, would be the beginning of that. We expect that there'll be escalations and there will be even bigger impacts from most companies. The regulators can ask you to stop using the data and really pause what you're doing. So imagine not being able to use your reporting systems or your websites or other impacts, your CRM database, your customer service tools that you have for supporting clients. Behind that, you've got the data requests that I mentioned from data subjects that couldn't flood your organization. You have 30 days to respond to those when they come in. You're going to have to be really well organized and ready to facilitate those. Now, you may have only had one or two over the last year, but with the law taking effect, consumers have a lot more capability to go after you for these things, and there will be lawyers that get involved in really pressing these cases. We'll see class action lawsuits. Most importantly, again, it's a matter of just organizing your operation so that you can quickly get to the data that you're going to need. If there's some sort of breach or your company shows up in the media for having done something that is considered to be reckless, you could find that you're getting hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of these per day and then having to scramble across your organization to get the data together. Lastly, I mentioned the ability now under the law giving a lot more credence to class action lawsuits and even affording the consumers the ability to solicit help from the data regulators, your data protection authorities, to support those cases. I talked a little bit about these Dpos, and again, I think this is something that your organization needs to be looking at. If you are in compliance with the law, you're going to need to have a team in place, and hopefully you've already started taking steps to get a Dpo. Again, we see the market ramping up very quickly to put more people in position and train and qualify more Dpos, but certainly a scramble in the market right now. As you go through your requirements, again, I would emphasize looking at the reporting obligations you have and the accountability. Not only do you have to have a strong privacy policy that's well understood by your users, you're now going to have to work across all of these different areas we've discussed today, your controllers, your processors, the data subjects themselves, making sure I've achieved the appropriate level of consent. I've understood the uses and where the data is going, which vendors are going to be involved, where it's being moved around the world. And I've got purpose behind it. I can show my legal basis for doing it. I have good data that tells me how it's being used, where it's being used, and what data we can stop collecting or perhaps purge altogether. And finally, as I look at what data is going in to be that purge, that I've got a strong retention policy. I know exactly how long I should be keeping this information and what happens in the event that we lose something. So think about this transformation as you look at your own operations as being something from what was perhaps a side concern to very, very core to the way that you're working. Many organizations that we talk to are looking at this still as kind of a fire drill. I've got to get ready for the law and make some quick changes. This really needs to move from being a sort of one-time action to something that is continuous. It's ongoing. It's evergreen across your organization. That the data that you're collecting is being very carefully monitored, that you've looked at it and made sure that what you're asking for from your consumers you really need, and again, that it's lawful in the way that it's being collected and utilized. Taking what might have been perhaps in the past a spreadsheet or some sort of quick form that you collected all this information on and moving it to something that is more automated, that continually collects the data and prepares reporting that is ever informed, that you're doing that in a way that's very automated. Too often we see organizations try to do this via spreadsheets, and I'm emailing them out to different people in the company. They're not responding, or I'm getting partial answers. They're trying to delegate it to somebody else, and the data just gets lost. What you'll need here under the law is something that continually feeds that information back, that gives you good visibility into where your processes are getting stuck, who's not reporting. And again, as you get those reporting in, you've got good dashboarding to show where there's problems, that we're flagging up the data. These are core areas that OneTrust can help with, and there are others in the market like us. Finally, rounding out the list, again, moving this from being something that's a real burden and everyone is complaining about to something that helps you innovate, that builds trust with your clients, that becomes a differentiator for your business, that you continually try to look at this as an opportunity and not an obligation, that we move from having dated or stale reporting on what's out there to something that is real-time, that is evergreen and current. And finally, that it stops being a distraction and really becomes, again, something that's reflexive. It's part of the way that your organization works. So hopefully you've seen, again, this is a change not only in the way that you're operating and the technologies that you're employing, but also almost a philosophical way of looking at privacy, that it needs to be embraced by the organization, and that's really what you'll find behind the law. The last thing I'll mention here is, as we look at companies, we often get the question of who's doing the work across the organization, and I wanted to include just a quick slide from several deployments that we've worked on. Typically, you see a sort of hit squad that's put together to try to get to a compliance posture, getting through sort of the key areas that they know are big concerns. As the program moves into a run state, though, we have ongoing roles, and those are typically going to be supported by both your legal teams, your executive teams, and then some of the business teams that feed into that director of privacy or the privacy officer who will gather that information up from the different business units and make sure, again, that we're staying ahead of the curve, we're compliant with the law, we're doing things that really address the needs of privacy under the GDPR. Yep, okay. I think I am just about out of time here, so I will wrap up and just say in closing, that OneTrust offers a suite of tools, as I mentioned before. We'd love to show them to you today. We do have a booth out on the floor. For those of you interested in the slides, please come by. We'll be happy to share them with you and email them to you. The other thing I'll mention, we've actually printed off several hundred copies of the GDPR. So for everyone in attendance, if you'd like a desktop reference, this takes you through the full 99 articles of the law, as well as all the recitals that go into it. We'll be happy to give you one of these at the booth today. Thanks very much for the time this morning. Very pleased to talk with you.